Good evening. Welcome to this event that will be a mix of both words and silence, and will be a mix of both the words we use when we are grieving and celebrating, and the silence we use in different circumstances. The event is part of the EPIC project, which is Epistemic Injustice in Healthcare. There are flyers on your seats. You might need to sit up and grab it. And the project is a Discovery Award funded generously by Wellcome and administered by the University of Bristol, with Nottingham, Birmingham, and Swansea as partners. I'm the principal investigator of the project, and some of our researchers, who you will meet in a minute, work on silence in its various guises and the ways in which it enables or disables people from being present and representing themselves in a variety of ways. We will be talking not just about silence in the context of healthcare and of epistemic injustice. We'll also be talking about silence in the context of music, hence us being in St. George's, and we've got a incredibly interesting panel of speakers who you will meet in a bit. We will actually start with silence, and we will then do some singing and talking, and more silence, and more talking. And I will also say that I am asking to dedicate this event in memory of my brother, Jordan Carell. Our first speaker will be Kate Binney, who is a music therapist and researcher exploring breathing spaces, which she will give us now.
So before we have some silence, I just wanted to introduce my little section. So I'm going to briefly introduce us to the idea of attunement, which is the human capacity to tune into another's affect or emotions without or beneath words. So I'll invite us in a moment to collectively attune to the space we're sharing, the silence in the room, and just to prepare ourselves really for the music we're about to hear, the things we're going to feel, to tune into our bodies and to pay attention to our body's relationship between sound and silence. So my perspective is grounded in music therapy and meditative practices with people towards the end of life. And I approach silence not simply as the absence of sound, but as a relational field that carries within it different textural qualities. Drawing on perspectives from music therapy based on neurobiological theories of co-regulation, contemplative practice, and relational philosophy, so I'm particularly thinking about Martin Buber's work. This view suggests that silences can be experienced as spacious and regulating, or tense and withholding, and anything in between. So these shifting qualities of silence have reciprocal causal influence on breathing and bodily states, shaping the interpersonal space. From this perspective, silence has a vital and powerful role in the embodied dynamics of a human encounter. So we feel silence in our bodies. We feel something. So we all know the difference between an aggressive or withholding silence and a spacious silence that we've chosen. And I think what's been interesting in my research into mindfulness is just how dysregulating silence can be. And if any of you have tried mindfulness, you might have come away thinking, well, I'm really bad at that, or I found that really awful. And that's because silence can open the gate on unbearable emotions. It can flood us with difficult experiences that we're not ready to have. So I think this assumption that silence and meditative practice is good for us and is good for everything and good for everybody must really be challenged. So before I invite us to just have a couple of minutes of silence, I just really want to reassure you that you can take this silence however you want. If you want to think about what you're having for supper, that's fine. If you want to, think about the work you've got to do tomorrow, that's fine. I think it's so important to allow us to interpret and have this silence in the way that we would like and that is useful to us, that is restful for us. So I've got some little bells, and all I'm going to suggest is that we take a moment together. I'm not actually timing it, but I'll just take what feels right, a couple of minutes, just for us to settle into our bodies, perhaps. I'm just going to invite us to settle into our bodies, to perhaps uncross our legs, perhaps put down the things that we're holding, and maybe start to just allow ourselves to tune into, so attune to the room, to the sounds we can hear outside the room, to what it feels like to be in your body today, which was different from yesterday and is different from what it will be tomorrow. And just perhaps just start to feel your body settling into the chair, your shoulders relaxing away from your ears. And just start to allow yourself to breathe naturally in your own way, in your own particular way, which is as natural to you as it's completely unique to you. So I'll ring the bells and we'll just have a moment of silence together. So perhaps together we could just breathe in and exhale. Well, I can actually feel the room settle. It's amazing. Thank you for sharing that silence with me. Oops.
Next, we're going to have Dr. Dan Degerman, who's a postdoctoral researcher on the EPIC project, who will be using words rather than silence to talk about silence.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. Like Javi said, I am a postdoctoral fellow on the EPIC project, and I'm based here at Bristol, or at Bristol University. So I'm a philosopher. You could even say that I'm a philosopher of silence, insofar as that's what I've been working on for the past however many years now. I'd like to tell you a bit about how I became interested in silence. So a few years ago, it kind of struck me that, well, in philosophy, but also I think in society more broadly, and I think especially in this British society we live in, speech gets a lot of attention. And I think speech gets a lot of accolades too, compared to silence, which we don't talk about very much. So it seems to me like we talk a lot about how good it is to talk, how important it is, how to open spaces for speech and better speech. And meanwhile, it seems like we only really talk about silence, or mostly talk about silence, when it gets in the way of speech. And then it's primarily to find ways of breaking silence as quickly as we can. Now, as someone who has both been labeled and thought of themselves as a quite silent person for most of their lives, this kind of narrowly negative perspective on silence that we often find, and the kind of neglect of silence that comes with it, didn't really sit right with me. Well, of course, silence is sometimes harmful, right? Sometimes we're silent even though we want to talk and we think we'd benefit from talking because we're afraid of what people would think if they heard what we have to say. And those fears are often justified, especially for those of us who are part of an ethnic minority or live with a particular kind of illness, right? But silence can also be beneficial, and I think we all recognize this, and maybe some of us felt this firsthand during the meditation. And sometimes we're silent because it feels good, and because we feel like it offers us a moment's respite from the demands that the world puts on us. Now, of course, what I've just pointed to are just two kind of parts of a wide spectrum of silence. Or as one person put it to me that I spoke to during my research, 2 spots on the rainbow of silence. And something that I hope that this evening will do for all of us is to get us to think a bit more carefully and engage more with the rainbow of silence and the role that it plays in our lives. Right. So you might broadly agree with everything I've said so far, but you might think, that's fair enough, but what is silence? So like a good philosopher, I'm going to give you some definitions and distinctions to help you, or I should say, that have helped me think more carefully about silence, and I hope they will do the same for you. So a first distinction I'd like to put to you is a distinction between what we might call literal silence on the one hand and metaphorical silence on the other. Now, literal silence I take to be quite simply the actual absence of noise or speech. So, for example, you in the audience now are literally silent. But that's, of course, just one half of silence, we could say. There's another kind of broad category that we use or that we name as silence, and that's metaphorical silence. What's metaphorical silence? Metaphorical silence is when we're speaking, but we're not speaking about something in particular. Right? So right now, I'm speaking to you about silence, but I'm not speaking to you until just now about what I had for breakfast, right? Or what I'm going to do after this. And some of in the audience had an expectation about what I was going to speak about. Maybe Javi might be sitting there feeling like I'm being metaphorically silent about epistemic injustice and how it relates to silence, right? So that's the metaphorical silence. Now, one of the problems I think we have, or rather something I'd like you to think about tonight, is whether we, the speakers, are properly distinguishing between metaphorical silence and literal silence. Because I think when we talk about silence, especially in public discourse, we often run the two together. So I'd like you to also think about what implications it might have when we're not insisting on these distinctions. Now, a second useful distinction I think it's important to make is within this category of literal silence that I just mentioned. And that's between objective silence on the one hand and lived silence on the other. So by objective silence, I mean something like what this microphone would pick up from the room if I stopped speaking, right? It's a kind of measurable silence that an instrument can pick up on, and no particular human really needs to hear. If no one was in this room, someone could see what gets picked up on this microphone and then say what's silent in this room. Now, I might contrast that with lived or subjective silence, which is what I am experiencing from you right now, even though you might not be objectively silent in the sense that if I put a microphone in front of your face right now, it would probably pick up on your breath and so on. So, another thing I'd like you to think about tonight is whether we're distinguishing between objective and lived silence, And if we're talking about lived silence, who's experiencing that silence? And why is it experienced the way it is? And something you might in particular want to think about or pay attention to is the times at which objective silence and lived silence might come apart. So think, for example, if you walk into a room and you have a bit of tinnitus like me, even if that room is objectively silent, what I face in that room might actually be less of a silence, of a lived or maybe peaceful silence, than I'd experience in a room with a bit of background noise. Now, of course, we have these specific words for specific types of silences in English. We have quite a few of them. Think, for example, of terms like awkward silence or peaceful silence or pregnant silence. And these are all terms that seem to pick out particular kinds of lived, literal silence, right? They really only make sense insofar as we're using them to describe a kind of lived absence of speech or noise that we're experiencing as awkward and so on. But there's something else that's interesting about these types of silences that I want to point you to, and that will get us to a third distinction. So awkward silence, pregnant silence, and so on, they're referring to a kind of silence that's jumped out at us, right? And becomes something that we maybe enjoy, or maybe that we endure, or something that we try to maintain or try to end. So differently put, these silences, or these terms rather, refer to types of silence that have become explicit to us. They're in front of us. But not all silences that we encounter in our lives are like that. A lot of silences are implicit, right? When we refer to your silence again. Now, I've been talking about it so much, so this might no longer apply. But until I started talking about it, you were hopefully focused on what I was saying. You weren't thinking about being silent. Your silence provided a background that allowed me to speak and you to listen. In a kind of similar way, when you're walking down the street, listening to your podcast, or maybe just walking from point A to point B, you're not actively, probably, being silent. It just provides a background to whatever else you're doing. Now, I want to put to you that even though these silences are implicit, they're shaping our experience in very important ways. But despite their importance, and maybe because of their very implicitness, we tend to take these silences for granted. Now, we're able to do this, but as we might have a chance to get into later, something that I highlight in my research is that in some instances, particularly for people with certain types of illnesses, that's no longer possible. Something about your capacity to be silent can sometimes break down, and then even the most basic kinds of silences can become impossible. So a third and final thing that I'd like to think about tonight is the types of silences that you take for granted and that shape your life and that might obscure different aspects of the rainbow of silence. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Dan, for this magnificent overview. And I'm now going to hand over to Professor Emma Hornby, who's a professor of music, and her Schola Cantorum from the University of Bristol. And Emma will introduce them and the music we're about to hear. Can I make sure that the microphone won't pick us up? Is the microphone off? It's embarrassing for...
Back as far as you can, and then right together. Good. We're going to sing two things to you. The first thing, we're going to, very different, about 1,000 years apart. We're going to start by singing a psalm. In a psalm verses normally have half of an idea in the first half of the verse, and then the other half of the idea in the second half of the verse. You sing the first half of the verse, and then there's a moment where, because you're a monk and you've been singing the Psalms every week since you were 7, you know perfectly well what's coming. So it's a moment of, and there it is. The Lord goes up to the mountain. He goes up to the high mountain, and you know where you are. That's what this silence is. But there's more to it than that. The word for breath is the same as the word for spirit. And as in Eastern philosophy, we breathe out the bad, we take a moment, and we breathe in the good. And if you are in the Judeo-Christian tradition, what you're doing is you're breathing in God's spirit in that moment. So it is a theological silence. It's not just and it's not even just an intellectual silence, it's a silence full of spiritual potential. We're going to start by singing you some long silences. They're going to be long silences. This is what the Cistercian monks in the 13th century, who loved a bit of austerity, they sang what they called a pausa bona, a good silence. It's going to be long. We take a moment, we breathe out, we wait, and then we breathe in, and on we go. It's going to take a while. Just brace yourselves, it'll be about 5 verses, and then I'll tell you what's happening next. When you're sitting there thinking, I have no idea what's going on, we're singing the antiphon, the opening bit, the melody bit in Latin, and then, as you can see, my friends here today are majority Chinese, and so we're singing the psalm in Chinese, because you should sing psalms in a language you understand. The fact that Lottie and I don't understand, we've got pinyin, we're good, and everybody else knows what's going on. So when you're thinking strange Latin pronunciation, it's because it's not Latin. Okay, here we go. Don't clap at the end because I'm going to talk again. La 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 la. Confitebo tibi Domine. The liturgy takes a long time if you do it like that. As we do the second half of the psalm, try breathing with us. Please don't hyperventilate or anything like that. And if you're going to faint, just do your own breathing. But if you can, breathe gently out with us as we're singing. and then breathe in with us as we breathe in and go on. By the end of this psalm, all of our pulses will be in sync, and all of our heart rates will be in sync. We are literally tuning this little group. We are harmonizing ourselves physiologically by breathing together. So it's really hard to be a monk. You're living in a community of other really annoying men for like 70 years. Actually, okay, no, families are great, we love them too. But these are people you didn't choose, who just live in your monastery. This brings them together 7 times a day to retune, to set their pulses together, which means that you begin to respond together emotionally to what happens next. So I invite you to breathe with us. The second half of the psalm, we're going to sing the Franciscan way. The Franciscans said, enough of this. This is too much and we've got preaching to do. So what they have in the Franciscan tradition is a pausa conveniens, a convenient pause. So this is where we will simply breathe in and on you go. And if you're singing psalms in normal daily life, this would be a bit more what you do. So on we go from verse 6. Here we go.
他向百姓显出大能的作为，把为邦的地赐给他们为业。他所做行的是诚实公平，他的君子都是确实的，是永永远远坚定的，是按诚实正直设立的。他向百姓施行救赎，命定他的位置到永远。他的名声而可畏，敬畏耶和华是智慧的开端。但遵命令的便是光明人，耶和华是永远当赞美的，愿当荣誉与父及子，其生生其出入黑，今日依然直到永远。阿门。Confitebo tibi Domine in toto corde meo.
Thank you. I don't know how your breathing is feeling. Mine's feeling really calm now, although following the Chinese makes it slightly less calm. We're going to sing you something very distant, 1,000 years distant. This is a part of a piece written by Sarah Garrard, who used to be a PhD student in the University of Bristol. And I'm really delighted to spot that the person who commissioned this piece is in the audience tonight, so that's very cool. This is a psalm, so it is a psalm text. She wrote this having been singing psalms with Scholar. But she is using silence intentionally and measured. So when there is silence, I am counting 2, 3, 4, and on we go. All of the silences here are precisely measured how she wants them. So that's a different kind of silence. This is not as the Spirit moves us, but this is what a composer 7 or 8 years ago felt would be just the right length. So see what the silence here does for you. Is it tense? Is it relaxing? Is it contemplative? The answer may be different for different people. Just notice that the composer is giving you the opportunity to do something between the notes, and she's thought really carefully about it. Here we go. Hang on. I don't know which hand, what I wanted to I think, right, hands. Here we go.
I will come into thy house in the multitude of
Thank you so much to Emma and the Schola Cantorum of the University of Bristol. To finish off the first part of the event, I now invite John Pickard, who is a professor of composition and a composer.
Thank you. Good evening. As you've already gathered, for musicians, silence is as important as the notes. It's just part of what we do. It's reflected in our modern notational system. For notes, there are 4 parameters of representing them. There are the pitches, so the height. There's the length, the duration of pitches. There's dynamics, how loud or how soft they are. And there's articulation, which is a function of dynamics, but it's to do with the kind of attack on a note. 4 parameters. For rests, there's just 1 parameter, and that is, of course, duration. But a rest in music doesn't necessarily imply silence. If you're performing with even one other musician, you can stop playing and be silent, but the performer next to you is still making a sound. You're just part of the overall picture. And it's interesting that the word rest seems to be unique in English-speaking musical world. Most other languages, certainly European languages, use the word pause when they're referring to a rest. And there's a nice distinction between the 2 words, because a pause we understand as being a temporary cessation of something that is ongoing. A rest has the implication of respite and of relief. What we call a pause, other languages tend to call a fermata. And that has implications of ending. Think of fermer in French, to closure. And there's another word that we use, a bit less often in music, and that is tacet, T-A-C-E-T, which really does imply silence. Of course, it hangs around in general English language. We can refer to a tacit understanding, an unspoken understanding of something. That's where the word comes from. When a musician sees the word tacet, they know that they're not going to play or sing at all, maybe for an entire movement. If you're, for example, a percussion player, and you're not playing in a movement of a piece, you will see in your part tacet. If you're playing the cymbals in the slow movement of Bruckner's 7th Symphony, one clash, which is your only contribution to the entire 70-minute symphony, you will see in the part tacet until figure 102. That's very unhelpful because you have no way of knowing, unless you know the piece, where figure 102 is. But that's tacet. And the word tacet leads inevitably to the name John Cage, without whom any discussion of silence and music would be incomplete. And particularly his famous, we could say notorious, 1952 composition, 4 minutes, 33 seconds. 3 movements, each of them marked tacet. It's a much misunderstood work. Some people think it's a Dadaist kind of piece, an absurdist joke, maybe. I've heard it done in that way, performances done as a joke. But in fact, Cage was deadly serious when he created 4 minutes 33 seconds. You may be surprised to learn that there is a published score. You can buy it on Amazon. I checked this morning, $9.95. 5-star user reviews. The score fulfills the function of telling the performer what to do while leaving open certain parameters, including the crucial one of duration. The score is divided into 3 movements, as I said, each marked tacit, and there's a little written introduction which explains that at the first performance, the pianist, David Tudor, took a certain length of time for each of the movements. But, crucially, Cage goes on to say, the piece can be performed by any number of instruments and can last any amount of time. It is not true that 4 minutes 33 seconds needs to last 4 minutes 33 seconds. In fact, there are several versions of the score that Cage made over the years, including one that's written in proportional notation, based on 1 page equaling 7 inches, and 7 inches equaling 56 seconds of silence. Very precise. Where did these precise durations come from? They came from consulting the I Ching. Cage was the most wide-thinking of composers. He was the ultimate interdisciplinary composer, drawing his ideas and pushing his energies towards theatre, towards the visual arts, towards literature. And in fact, 4 minutes 33 was initially a response to the visual arts, to the abstract painter Robert Rauschenberg, who in 1951 produced a series of white paintings, canvases partitioned off into several different areas, all of them completely white. The idea being that the paintings changed according to the environment in which they were observed. The lighting, the positioning of the artwork itself within the room, the circulation of the viewers, their position in relation to the painting. So, in his way, Cage conceived 4 minutes 33 as a work in continuous flux, determined by ambient sounds. So, in fact, Cage's silent piece is there to make the point most emphatically that there is no such thing as silence. Even in an anechoic chamber, one hears one's breathing, one's heart, one's nervous system. As Dan mentioned earlier, those of us who have tinnitus, we hear that. And Cage, in 1973, produced a book of essays called Silence, in which he said, "There is no such thing as an empty space or an empty time. There is always something to see, something to hear. In fact, try as we may to make a silence, we cannot. Sounds occur whether intended or not. One must see that humanity and nature, not separate, are in this world together, that nothing was lost when everything was given away." So Cage's work is a denial of silence. The silence is the frame, and we fill it with whatever we like, intentionally or not. So when we perform 4 minutes 33 seconds, we can fill that silence if we wish to. We don't need to sit in silence to perform it. Or we can perform 4 minutes 33 seconds anytime we like. We can sit and listen to a recording. We can listen to a Mahler symphony, we can listen to a song by the Beatles, we can listen to anything. And we can perform 4 minutes 33 seconds ourselves whilst we are filling that space with, in this case, music or nothing at all. When we did the mindfulness exercise earlier on, everybody was doing it in a different way. For me, I was performing Cage's 4 minutes 33. Seriously, that was my intention. When I sat down to take part in that, I sat down with the intention that my participation would be a performance of that work. When we do this, we become not just the passive recipient of the work, but we become the performer and the composer of our own piece. In that sense, Cage's 4 minutes 33 is a profoundly democratic work. Anyone can do it at any time for any amount of time. And I would suggest that this is a profoundly stirring and positive idea. Not only does it invite creativity, but it confirms that where there is life, there is sound. And only in our own extinction do we encounter true silence. Last week, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, the conductor Mark Wigglesworth, who is recently appointed as the chief conductor of the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra. They were here last week to give a concert at the other place. Better not mention it. No, that's actually not true. The director of St. George's was in the audience also. We were having a conversation in the afternoon, and we started talking about silence, because I told him that I was participating in this event. And then we continued the discussion by email over the weekend. And this is one thing that he wrote to me. I think that one of the reasons audiences so often cough in the silences in music is because of the uncomfortable connection they make between it and the true silence of death. Thank you.
We are now going to have a panel discussion followed by a Q&A. I will introduce the panel, but first, actually, I will hand over to John, who's going to share a short video with us.
Thank you very much. At the end of my my little slot in part one, I quoted the conductor Mark Wigglesworth, who is also the author of a book on conducting called The Silent Musician. Something he wrote recently, I'd like to just quote this to introduce the clip I'm going to show you. Maybe before I do, I'm going to tell you about what we're going to watch, which is the end of a performance of Mahler's Ninth Symphony, performed by the Lucerne Festival Orchestra, conducted by Claudio Abbado in 2010. Abbado, as I expect many of you know, was one of the great conductors of the 20th, early 21st centuries. In his final years, he suffered a long period of serious ill health, resulting in major surgery, and from which he recovered and managed to come back to conducting for the last 10 years of his life. It was like it was almost miraculous that this happened, and this performance comes from that time. Mahler's Ninth Symphony was the last completed work of Mahler's, so it's always had this valedictory sort of quality associated with it, even though Mahler lived for another 3 years and almost finished the 10th Symphony. But there is something about the final page, which is what we're going to hear now, where the music fades into silence, into infinity. And this particular performance is very, very special for reasons which I think will become obvious. But I'd like to just quote Mark's words here, Mark Wigglesworth's words. Benjamin Britten used to talk about the holy trinity of musical experience being an equal relationship between composer, performer, and listener. We almost always have the composers doing their bit, and I feel privileged to have the overarching responsibility for the performance. The active listening from those in the hall is as significant as the performance itself, an intrinsic part of the performance, in fact. And in silence, everyone in the hall has an equal responsibility and opportunity to be the custodian of that silence. It seems impossible that it could go on as long as that. And I have to say, I think all credit to the video editors of that of that recording. The camera work could so easily ruin the presentation on the screen. It's as much a visual thing. But it was 2.5 minutes as the silence, and this has become quite legendary. If you look online, you will find many references to the silence in that particular performance, where the audience become active participants in the music. It's as though there is no obvious point where the music actually stops. It continues into the audience. Thank you for watching that.
Thank you so much, John. I'll quickly reintroduce our panelists. So Emma Hornby, Professor of Music, University of Bristol. Kate Binney, a music therapist and a practitioner and researcher, also working on the relationship between breath, mindfulness, and death and silence. Our new kid on the block, Dr. Anthony Everett from University of Bristol, who is a philosopher of language. Dan Degerman, Dr. Dan Degerman, the EPIC postdoctoral researcher, and John Pickard, Professor of Composition and Composer. I think I will start with you, Anthony, because so far we've talked about pauses and sounds relating to music. What about pauses and sounds relating to language?
So, I think those can be interesting at a whole range of different levels. So one interesting phenomena is how pauses, silences can be used to communicate, or could be misunderstood as acts of communication. So an example where somebody asks a question and there's a pause and a long silence, which could be interpreted and might often be interpreted in a range of different ways. So one thing I'm interested in doing is sort of thinking about that. A classic example of that would be from an old episode of The Simpsons, for example, where we may well remember Homer asks, "Marge, do you love me?" "Yes." "Oh, good. Oh, Marge, why did you pause so long?" "No reason." So we all understand what those silences convey, right? And so it's interesting from a perspective of philosophy of language, just to sort of think about the roles that not merely what's sort of explicitly said plays in communication, but also kind of the gaps, how that can communicate, maybe quite a lot often, but how that can also be misunderstood, right? Sometimes a silence is just a silence and it's not an act of communication, and people can be misunderstood. Because of that. So I'm interested in that, but also sort of corollary interest in that is thinking about fiction. Perhaps works of fact more broadly could be included within this, but thinking about how what's not said in a work of fiction, at least in some cases, can be actually really important in our response to it, in determining how we think of the fictional world, in determining the sort of perspective that the fiction projects, the extent to which we're kind of sucked in to try and fill in the gaps, the sort of cases in which those might be very jarring, or the sort of cases where those might be something that just passes under the radar, and actually kind of what's the sort of difference between that. Obviously fiction, work of fiction isn't going to tell us everything. It would be impossible for it to tell us everything about the world it's describing. But so it will only describe certain sort of things, leave lots of other bits unarticulated for the reader to fill in if they want to. Maybe it prods us to fill in certain gaps in certain ways, or discourages us. So I think a whole really important part of thinking about how we respond to fiction, both in terms of enjoying it aesthetically, but also in terms of what it communicates, is tied in with this, what it doesn't say, the gaps, the stuff that's left unsaid. So that would be a second form of interest that I have in silences and gaps in poetry. Why is this gap there? What is this doing? That sort of thing.
Can I just say something about that? Because has anyone read David Salsey's Flesh? It won the Booker Prize this year. And I was just thinking about that when you were speaking, because I found it an absolutely fascinating book. And it's so much about what isn't said. And it's so restful, actually, as a reader. No one's telling you really what's going on in this guy's mind. He's just sort of seems to be passive in his life. And his silence is so sort of present in the narrative, and it's so important. And yeah, so read it, because it's brilliant, and it's sort of articulate. It does that so brilliantly. And somehow I found it incredibly cleansing, that silence, that lack of noise from the writer telling you what to think. You know, it's very pure writing, and that's something about a sort of silence of what is not said, for you to imagine, you know, to imagine what's going on in this guy's life. It's a really brilliant book, so thank you.
Anthony, can you give us a bit more about what philosophers of language have said about silence? A brief tour, if we may.
So I think philosophers of language often will talk about speech rather than silence. So it's often seen as the exception, and as a failure to communicate, or a case of sort of speech breaking down. There are exceptions to that. So, but it is often regarded as perhaps not something that would be a primary focus of philosophy of language, or almost pathological, right? It's when communication breaks down. So it's sort of seen as a bad thing. So tying into some of what you were saying, Dan, that silences are seen as awkward, embarrassing failures of communication, breakdowns in communication, areas where perhaps there's the potential for misunderstanding. And a lot of philosophy of language is focused on the utterances, inscriptions that are actively communicating, passing information backwards and forwards between people. As I suggested, I think silences can play a really important role in that as well. I suppose there's another tradition too, which they would see silence as having an important role to play. This is perhaps would be embodied in cryptic Wittgensteinian claims, right? But there's the sort of idea that perhaps there are important truths about the human condition or something like that which can't be articulated explicitly in words, that language isn't the right sort of medium to convey those, and that might need to be conveyed in some other sort of way, perhaps shown or something like that. And perhaps silence can actually play a role in somehow communicating these sorts of ideas. So there is an alternative tradition that might see silence as playing a more important role. I'm not sure that philosophers of language necessarily be particularly prejudiced against silence, but it's kind of more, you're analysing the meaning of language, of utterances, of speech, etc., etc., etc. So it's in practice, perhaps more of a peripheral issue. Maybe that was changing, I don't know.
Can you add a little bit about Wittgenstein's famous claim?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can say anything very illuminating about that. So Wittgenstein, in common with some other people, I suppose the sort of basic idea is that there's something very important about the human condition which just can't be articulated using language. Quite frustratingly, he, in one of his books, he comes up with this sort of system about how language represents and describes the world, and at the very end, it looks like what he said should be meaningless, right? It sort of his account of language undermines the very book. And so there's this kind of a gnomic Wittgensteinian claim about, that of what we cannot speak, we must remain silent. And this sort of idea that perhaps his writing could illustrate something without literally describing it. And so I suppose the idea is that somehow or other it gives us some sort of insight, perhaps some practical insight into how things work or how we should live our lives or what's going on in certain sort of circumstances that can't really be articulated in words. Maybe a way of illustrating this idea actually would be maybe to go back to literature. So he doesn't make this comparison, but this might be a way of sort of trying to explain the thought there. So we often have the thought that we might learn something really important and deep and helpful from reading a great work of literature or seeing some amazing film or something like that. But then there's interesting questions. So if I was teaching a class, I would say, stick up your hand and give me an example. And Crime and Punishment, or Tarkovsky, or something like that. But then, what do you learn? Macbeth is a great deep play. What do you learn from Macbeth? That it's bad to kill people? Well, you probably knew that already, right? It's very, very difficult to put into... So people do have this kind of sense sometimes, right, that perhaps a film or a novel or a poem or a song or something can be very significant, very profound, can change the way they look at the world or themselves, at least a little bit, or maybe considerably. But when push comes to shove, you can't explain why. You just spout some sort of banality. It's something that can't really be put into words. And so maybe a sort of charitable interpretation of Wittgenstein is he might see his philosophy as doing something akin to that. It's giving us a new perspective on things that you couldn't really put into words. And silence might be the appropriate response to certain sort of phenomena in that sort of context. So, but that's probably the best I can do. He's a very difficult thinker.
I'm interested in the prohibition to speak, the hier muss man schweigen, right? This idea that you, I guess English doesn't have an equivalent for being silent isn't quite the same. And that leads us back to Dan's work on, I guess, the politics of silence, or maybe other people have thoughts on that kind of prohibition, the situations, the context in which we are not allowed to speak.
Should I speak to the politics of silence? So to set it against or alongside what Anthony said, I guess I partly came into this topic feeling that there was in philosophy of language this approach to silence that we saw in a lot of philosophy, where silence, when it came up, was almost always as this kind of state of oppression, right? Where we're not able to say what we want to say, either literally, where someone is preventing us from speaking, or more metaphorically, where someone has put in place, or society has put in place so many prejudices and structures against us that what we're saying just can't be heard as we mean for it to be heard, right? Something that I've been trying to develop, and part of my work is a view, I'll not set against this, but kind of highlighting that, while of course those things happen, even in a state of oppression, you can use silence in creative ways to resist power. And some of this, what I, in my more radical moments, call like the fetishization of speech and silence breaking, can sometimes work against those people who say, are using their silence as a way to at least temporarily disengage from these oppressive structures to find new ways of speaking that might be able to break through.
Emma, silence and breath. And I know it's a big theme, but can I invite you to say something about that?
Intrinsically, in our utterances, there are moments of silence. And then the question, I suppose, is how intentional is that silence and how controlled is that silence? And do we use that silence conveniently to think? Or do we use that silence as an opportunity for something to happen spiritually, or for something to shift in our mental state? Or so it's partly because I'm a wind player. So I'm a wind player and a singer. So for me, the breath is where it all starts. And the potential in the in-breath of what happens next is crucial to what you're doing artistically and spiritually and all the other things.
It opened a lot of other questions. Kate.
Yeah, thank you. We were talking about this in the break. I mean, breath is spirit. In all cultures and across all time, breath is more than just respiration. And I mean, I found that profoundly moving. I'd never seen that before. And I noticed that movement at the end of this, before that, of this expansion. Did you see his expansive gesture? The roundness, this opening. And it was like an in-breath before the final exhalation, if you've ever been with somebody who's died. And this is my work. There's the in-breath, and then there's the final out-breath. And there was something so extraordinary about that, because here is a man rehearsing his death. And there was that in-breath, and then there was that exhalation. So this is, there's breath is life, and absence of breath is not life, is death. And so, breath and silence, as you said, I mean, that this is why silence can be so incredibly threatening. Because you are at the wall, really. You are facing the ultimate break in attachment, connection to breath, connection to life. And I see breath in my work when I'm working with people who are facing their last breath. It's very maternal for me. Maybe I'm saying that because I'm a woman. But there's something about that gesture, that rounded gesture of the breath, the cradling movement of the breath, the lullaby of the breath, I call it, that is so healing and so profound. And it rocks until it stops. And for me, that performance was literally embodying that. I mean, we could see it happening, couldn't we? There was a very, very sick man rocking himself to his last breath. And it was, really beautiful. So,
can I invite you to say something more about your work as a music therapist with people where you actually help them to articulate or sing or put music and words together to provide a final message, I presume, followed by that silence?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting job because sometimes, I've gone into the room and they've seen me come in with my violin. So I'm a violinist. So it's interesting because I would say that as a violinist, you watch those people, there's the in-breath and then the bow comes down on the string. So, I mean, I've had experiences where I've, gone into the room and someone said, "Oh, fuck off." Excuse my French. Because they want to be, they want to be angry and they want to die in their own way. So I think there's a lot of assumptions about dying well, which I take issue with. So people will die in their own way, in silence, turning their face to the wall, or screaming and shouting and angry, or anything in between, and it's all fine. But if they will accept me, then one of the most profound things I can do, and I've learned this in my practice. So when I first started, bustle in, kind of, "Hi, I'm the music therapist." totally dissonant. And I really learnt to use silence. And that practice, so I think we have to rehearse being good at silence. My practice, which is singing, is breathing, is meditating, is walking, my practice gives me the ability to inhabit my own silence, so that when I'm with someone who is suffering, I'm able to remain present and silent and not anticipating or putting something into that space, so that when the creative act happens, it might be one note. It might be a sound that I might support with my own instrument, maybe a guitar, maybe a violin. It's not... So Cicely Saunders, who is the godmother of the modern palliative care movement, talks about the depth of time, not the length of time that you spend with somebody. And I think we could talk about the depth of silence. So that was a long, deep silence that we just witnessed. But the depth of silence that you share with another person is profound. And out of that, in my work, might come some kind of piece or song or something that I might record, I might give to relatives. But really, that product is not the point. It's almost the process that unfolds from a silence that I have learnt and practiced and rehearsed to be able to inhabit and share with that person, if that makes sense.
John, did you want to add on the silence and breath?
Just returning to what we saw on the screen. I think one of the things that impresses me is that the silence there is collective. There are 2,500 people in that hall, and what comes across, to me at any rate, and to others I've spoken to, there seems to be nothing forced about that silence. It's not as though the conductor is just holding it up and stopping any sound from happening. It's quite the reverse, as you say. He kind of gathers it up and holds it, and then. Although the camera spends a good deal of time on him, I think the silence is then handed over to the audience. And it seems, I've seen this a number of times now, and it seems a comfortable silence. Goodness knows who had the courage to begin the applause. I suppose it had to happen sooner or later, but somebody had to make that decision. And it would be very interesting to know how that decision was made, that there was one person, obviously, who felt now is the time to start. Yeah.
It seemed to me he moved. He made a micro movement.
He moved a few times, didn't he?
He moved differently.
The musicians lowered their instruments for quite some time before the applause started.
The violas gave up first. Did anyone else notice?
Well, they're too heavy to hold.
Oh, really?
So they didn't do that on cue? It wasn't that they knew a time to put down their instruments?
No, I'm absolutely certain of it. There was, it was just in the moment.
I thought the first violinist had some, because I thought the first violinist was the first to lower the...
No, the viola's bows had gone down.
The viola's seated on the right.
But what I think you were saying, I think what was so interesting, just sort of bringing that together, is that, you said there was no forcing. And is it Rumi who talks about the river, no forcing, no holding back, the breath, no forcing, no holding back. So in my work, I'm interested in co-regulation, which is actually a physiological process. So when the singers are singing together, there's this process of co-regulation. So maybe 3,000 people were co-regulating in that room. And it happens at football matches. It happens when you go to a rave. It happens, it's very common in collective experience. But that was a particularly profound. It wouldn't have been interesting to wire everybody up and get sort of biofeedback. but that was, and we felt it in our bodies. I was consciously allowing myself to experience that in an embodied way. And I felt that regulation happen. So it's interesting.
And I think in this particular case, it is worth pointing out that that silence came after 75 minutes of the most passionate, turbulent music. Imagine it, that symphony goes through every conceivable human emotion in the course of 75 minutes. It is colossal, and the concentration that is required from the performers to get to that level of quiet playing at the end. Well, what we heard, the music that you heard, is one page. It's literally the final page of the work, the whole of the final page. And you could count the number of notes that happen in the 5 minutes that we were listening to that music. So what the musicians are facing is something utterly colossal, and they have to do the most difficult thing of all at the end. And then they're rewarded with that silence in that performance, which is very special.
Just to keep riffing on this, something that I find really interesting, despite I'm not denying that there might have been some co-regulation going on, but it's fascinating that in a room of 3,000 people, there weren't some that happened to come from the sort of cultural background where you just couldn't stand silence for that long, right? So there are some really fascinating cultural studies on the differences in how people...
It's a really posh festival.
Well, yeah, so you just got to imagine that they were all like lords and ladies,
the
right?
CERN festival, it's 300 euros a ticket, yeah.
But even then, right, there could have been... So I was at a party the other weekend, and silence always comes up when I'm at a party, usually because I say something awkward. But I was speaking to this guy who was from Uganda, and he was saying that one of the salient experiences that he had when he moved here was silence, right? There, in the culture that he's from, not only is there very little silence because you're all like often living together in quite a large family, but there's also a lot of crosstalk, right? So unlike here, for example, where we kind of let each other finish our sentences generally, there you kind of talk over each other and you start your sentence before someone has finished what they wanted to say, right? And it's just quite interesting that we, and I think this is part of what I was suggesting earlier, that we have this tendency to take silences for granted. Now, of course, like if we want to talk about something, as I want to talk about, the capacity for silence, this capacity will vary radically from person to person, from culture to culture. And I think, as you suggested, we need different amounts of silence, and we can handle different amounts of silence, whether that's our own silence or someone else's silence. Yeah, and just that there wasn't just by sheer chance someone in the audience who couldn't stand it and just start clapping right away. I think it's quite amazing.
I'll hand over to Emma, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
One of the things that interests me most about silence is what purpose it is put to. So that thoughtful silence at the end of the Mahler is about contemplating life and death within a secular concert hall going experience. The silence in a Catholic Mass where the priest just sits quietly until the moment's right and then moves on is aspiring towards a very different kind of a connection, and that's a connection with the divine. So, and then a silence can just be awkward because nobody quite knows what to say next, and there's nothing profound about that at all. It's just ghastly. So thinking that this immensely powerful thing that happens that we can control and shape to different ends, and what I think something that powerful, there's sort of a moral responsibility to use it for something worthwhile.
If you had a word or sound that would, for you personally, for your kind of meaning of silence, what would that word or sound be?
That's a brilliant question. Inspiration.
the end of the exhalation.
Pass.
I want to reject the premise of the question. I think John Cage is wrong. There is such a thing as silence. We create silence. We are the beings. Let me paraphrase Sartre. We are the beings that put silence in the world, into the world. So that's all I have to say about that.
I'm just so glad I'm a composer. I don't have to worry about all this. All I can say, this is totally off the point, but I composed a silence the other day. It's quite a nasty silence, actually. So I'm writing a new symphony at the moment. It's my seventh, and the passage I was working on was, sorry, this is totally off the point. The music is very, very loud. It's a real sort of pile-on. The brass and the percussion are going absolutely crazy. And the tension gets ratcheted up and up and up and up. And then there's a silence for a whole bar. And then it carries on. And it gets even worse. So I did it deliberately. To me, it's a rhetorical device. So I suppose what one answer from as a composer is rhetoric. Yeah. That's what it is for me. It's a form of musical rhetoric.
Thank you so much for coming.